A game of chess that spans the globe. China seems to be winning. The U.S. doesn't even realize it's playing. At stake, the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Whoever controls them gains military power. China has been buying up islands in the region, paving the way for future military bases. Unlike news from the South China Sea and larger Indo-Pacific regions, those actions haven't been making headlines. Rather, the silent development is much closer to U.S. shores. In this special report, we look at what China's presence there means for the U.S. going forward and what can be done to even the playing field. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Is China launching an attack from behind America's defenses? That's what some are saying. Asia czar Kurt Campbell recently hinted that China poses a, quote, strategic surprise in the Pacific. So what does that mean? Let's look at a map to see what's really being played out. News headlines proclaim the U.S. and its allies are holding joint naval drills in the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific region near something called the First Island Chain.
Effectively, it's a chain of islands that stretch from Japan down to Taiwan, to the Philippines, down to Indonesia and Malaysia.
Grant Newsham, senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, goes on to note why the chain is so important.
And effectively, if you look at the map, it blocks off the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, when it's trying to get out into the Pacific. So it's really a defense line, and Taiwan is right in the middle of it. And obviously, if the middle of your defense line falls, that the other side has really free access into the Pacific. But that hasn't happened yet. So what the Americans are really thinking is to kind of defend along that first island chain. And that's sort of the front of America's defenses.
This chain of islands blocks China's military from accessing the deep waters of the Pacific Ocean. Reaching those waters would allow China's nuclear-armed submarines to dive deep enough to avoid U.S. detection and be able to launch a surprise assault on American shores. Now, as Newsham points out, if there's a front to the defense line, there's a back.
What the Chinese have done very cleverly over the last 20, 30 years really, is to establish themselves in practically every island in the Pacific, to including American territories. China has got a presence, a foothold, in nearly every island in the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, the Southwest Pacific, and as far as the west coast of Latin America. So while America's defending forward, China is popping up in the rear.
To do it, Beijing has been racking up influence in what's known as the Second Island Chain. Alex Gray, senior fellow of the American Foreign Policy Council, explains.
So the Second Island Chain is basically Oceania, the islands that stretch through Guam, Micronesia, down through Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, down towards Australia and New Zealand.
The importance of this second island chain goes back centuries. But let's just look at World War II.
And these are the islands that Japan made a tremendous effort to militarize, to colonize, to fortify, and that a tremendous amount of blood and treasure was expended by the Americans and our allies to liberate these islands in World War II.
Now, some might argue that's all in the past, but these islands also serve another purpose.
Strategically, they're so important because if you're thinking about with the United States military needing access to East Asia, whether the scenario is a hypothetical scenario involving Taiwan, a scenario involving Japan, a scenario involving the Korean Peninsula, we have to have the ability to supply our forces in the region from the West Coast and from Hawaii, primarily by ship. And in order to do that, we have to pass through the islands that comprise that second island chain.
Now, judging by news headlines, it seems the U.S. has focused on the first island chain, but China's taking a different approach.
China has expressed interest in military bases across that second island chain because we have to have unfettered access to get our troops, our ships, our aircraft, our supplies through those islands.
Cutting off that kind of access has been a military strategy stretching back through the ages.
We know that historically having that access is critical to being able to project power throughout the region and also being able to deny access to your competitor.
And Beijing seems to be brushing up on that history.
Historically, if you take a map of where Imperial Japan had its military bases before and during World War II, and you overlay that with where China has publicly expressed interest in gaining military access, it's almost the exact same location. Sometimes it is literally the exact same location. Manus Island in Papua New Guinea is one example where literally the Japanese had a base before and during World War II, and we know that China publicly attempted to get a base before the U.S. and Australia were able to head that off.
As for how critical that access is,
I would say one of our highest strategic priorities in the Pacific since World War II and including now is to ensure that those islands remain free and open for the U.S. and our allies to access East Asia.
But how did China get such a foothold?
Starting with commercial presence, getting Chinese people into these islands, running small businesses, taking over, dominating the main industries, say the fishing industries, for example. And commercial presence and power equals political power, and particularly as the Chinese go to work.
What's more, there are a number of ways to grab onto that political power. Here are a few of them.
Paying bribes and offering investments that sound very attractive, that they win over parts of these island societies. You don't have to have everything, you just have to have enough. And there is a pro-China constituency in just about every Pacific island on the map.
But there's something else contributing to that problem.
I would cite the American diplomatic presence. We don't have embassies in all that many places. Recently, there was trouble in the Solomon Islands, which made the news. And the Solomon Islands are strategic terrain. They were hotly fought over in World War II as well. You'd think, well, the American embassy in the Solomon Islands, they're on top of things and they'll keep things under control. But America doesn't have an embassy in the Solomon Islands. It's covered by somewhere else, I think New Guinea. Kiribati, which I just mentioned, once again, there's no U.S. embassy there.
Out of the 12 independent Pacific Island countries, the U.S. has embassies in around half of them. Instead, the U.S. relies on allies like Australia and New Zealand to take care of the issue.
And if you're not there, you're not interested. And it is about that simple. So that permanent presence is the important thing. Then you need a military presence as well.
Without that diplomatic or military presence, China has been able to exert control over these islands.
We've seen it in Samoa, we've seen it in Vanuatu, where China now has political leverage that followed its economic leverage. And that's what we're seeing over time, is that as that political leverage grows, as the economics become more intertwined, we're seeing these countries change their perspective on geopolitics to accommodate their lender, Beijing. And one of the first signs is that they changed recognition from Taiwan to Beijing. And then we saw it in the Solomons, we saw it in Kiribati in 2019.
That kind of leverage wasn't gained overnight, and the process has been an extensive one. Part of it traces back to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Under the foreign investment policy, many developing countries get hooked on the regime's economic lending, to the point that they end up in massive debt. That leaves them open to the kind of political leverage Gray brings up. So that's the economic and political front. But what happens in case of war?
The next step is to have potentially dual-use civil military facilities, port access agreements where China can potentially have Coast Guard and naval vessels call consistently at ports in places where they have significant economic and political relationships in the second island chain, and then down the road, potentially have a permanent military facility like they do in Djibouti. And that's really the worst case scenario.
But some countries in the area haven't caved to China's money.
And I would cite the island nation of Palau, which is to the east of the Philippines. It's actually, it has a special relationship with the United States, whereby the Americans take care of Palau's defenses, as they do with Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. But Palau, a year and a half ago or so, asked the Americans to set up a military base in Palau. And that took some real courage by the president of Palau, but also the U.S. ambassador there really deserves a lot of credit. He's got a tiny staff, but really through, I think, and I'll bet this is the case, through his initiative, his hard work, that he was able to bring this about.
By taking that kind of stance, Newsham explains that Palau's president has put himself in front of China's crosshairs. But despite that risk, the U.S. hasn't rushed to send over a defensive military presence.
It's amazing, actually, that the COFA states, Marshalls, Micronesia, and Palau, actually still like us. I'm only half joking, because I'll bet you that every leader in that country has been offered a blank check by the Chinese, and yet they have stuck with us, as they have for a long time.
Now, some might ask what the fuss is all about, since these islands are so small.
These islands they may be very small in geographic terms, but in terms of strategic importance, they are immensely valuable.
Taking that value into account, what can be done to counter China's sights on them?
First, you have to be there. And as I mentioned, you've got to have an adequate diplomatic presence all over the place. And you can't say, well, we'll just leave it up to the Australians or we'll leave it up to the New Zealanders. The Americans need to be there on their own right.
But it's not just a diplomatic side.
Also, there's a need for sort of more commerce, more Western and or Japanese and Taiwanese commerce in the area. That takes some clever thought to actually make that happen. But with the right guarantees and, as I say, the right approach, you can attract a certain amount of business into the area. If there's no American business there, well, the Chinese are going to fill the void.
But there's another possibility to help even the playing field, teaming up with allies.
The Americans should link up with the Japanese and have really a systematic scheme for developing infrastructure throughout the Pacific. They have made some efforts, but it needs to be, as I said, more systematic. Get the Australians in, maybe the South Koreans as well. There has been some efforts along these lines, but it really hasn't borne the kind of fruit that it should.
Gray explains why a joint effort is critical.
All those countries have their own individual relationships, their own histories in the islands. So as a unified group, we have a lot of leverage in the region. So I think that's important, that this doesn't just need to be a United States effort.
There's one more aspect.
Having the Pacific Islands on side, and particularly the three so-called COFA states, these are the ones that have that special arrangement with the Americans that lets the Americans handle their defense, which means the Americans can exclude any other military from their territory, and we have the right to operate there. That is priceless.
COFA stands for Compacts of Free Association. It's a deal the U.S. has with certain island nations, like the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands.
It's a very special agreement that we have, which allows the U.S. to have unfettered military access to all three countries. We provide for their defense, and in exchange, we provide them some level of economic assistance and some special concessions. But those relationships, because of the strategic location of those three islands, those relationships are absolutely paramount to U.S. national security and to our presence and our posture in the Indo-Pacific.
Gray points out that all three proved significant battlefields during World War II. As COFA comes up for renegotiation and China creeps across the chessboard through these waters, Gray shares a message above all others.
I hope that in the coming weeks and months, I hope that the administration will act very aggressively to shore up our presence in the region and to send the right signal about our long-term commitment to being what we've been for our entire history, which is a Pacific power.
The importance of the Pacific Ocean to the United States stretches back to the time of John Quincy Adams' presidency in the 1820s. That's when he championed the building of the American Navy. Just like back then, control of these waters can mean the difference between freedom and oppression.